I think for those two, there's some positions.
What are you looking at?
Good afternoon. T.S. Eliot very famously said that in my end is my beginning. And here at the end of his time at Wayland Catholic College, Blaise has decided to return to the beginning, to return to the Iliad, the poem that begins the Western tradition, the poem that is so central to our entire humanities track. One might say the poem that is so central to what it is to be human. And Blaise has come back to this poem with, I think, a wiser eye, seeing things in it that he had never seen before, seeing it with a greater depth than he could have as a freshman. And I think this is a beautiful way to approach a senior thesis, is to return to something that you've done, because you are more, you see more in it. So with that, I will introduce Blaise Galbraith. His oration is entitled, aggressively, violently, fittingly. So you're gonna die.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you all for being here today. Before I get started, I would like to give a special thank you to Dr. Tiffany Schubert for being both my advisor throughout the senior thesis and through this presentation. I would also like to thank Dr. Henry Zepeda for being the second reader of my thesis and for his feedback, and to Dr. Glenn Arbery for his influence on the project and for being the third panelist here today. So, you're going to die. And it's even possible that some of us here may not even only die, but die violently in pain. This is rather rough news to take, but I'm not the first to break this news to you, and I'm probably not going to be the last. But a crucial question remains: what exactly are you going to do about it? Will you run from it? Will you try to fight it? Will you simply surrender to it? There's only one thing that's for certain. You're going to come to an end. And I'm here to tell you that if you're going to face your end, you had better do it heroically. But what does that even mean? What is heroism? What does it mean to do violence or to suffer it? And what does it even mean to die? These are questions which one must answer if one is to make any approach to one's own mortality. Today, we will be looking at the approach to violence, suffering, and death. First, through Homer's Iliad as the foundational work of the tradition of Western literature, from which all other epics take some measure of inspiration. Then, through the Passion of Christ in the Gospel of John. But before we can even begin to understand these great works, we have to do some philosophical legwork. And like all philosophical expeditions, this begins with primary definitions. To be a human being is to be a mortal being. Now, this shouldn't surprise any of you, but very rarely do we take the time to appreciate that this definition is something of a contradiction in terms. To be a being is to have being. It is the fundamental act of any being to simply exist. Before one can walk or talk or have any relation to anything else, one must first exist. So it is our fundamental act as beings simply to be. However, we are also mortal beings, which means it is a fundamental part of our nature to die, to cease to exist. Therefore, we exist only to not exist. We seem to be a contradictory creature. It makes no sense. This might be uncomfortable to think about, and it should be. If one has ever observed death, then you are aware that there is something fundamentally wrong about it. There is an uncomfortable atmosphere that hangs around it. And unfortunately, it gets worse. Not only are we all by nature fated to die, Before we die, we're going to suffer. Now we'll take a look at what that means in full. But it seems that we are trapped in a dilemma, where we exist only to suffer and die. And is there some way out of it? Something we can do about this contradiction? Well, the foremost approach to this is through heroism. Heroism is the act of attempting to create an aspect of one's being, one's identity, which does not die. Some greater meaning which survives our immortality. So we need to look at the phenomenon of violence. Violence is typically defined as the use of force with intent to cause harm in order to resolve conflict. This is a three-part definition, and it's important to look at each of these three parts in turn. The first part is that violence is the use of force. If you will look at the top of your quotation handout, which you will see, the first quote is from Simone Weil's essay, The Iliad, or the Poem of Force, in which she refers to the use of force almost as though it were a mathematical operation. Quote, "It is the X that turns anybody who is subjected to it into a thing. Exercised to the limit, it turns man into a thing in the most literal sense. It makes a corpse of him. Somebody was here, and the next minute, there is nobody here at all. This is a spectacle the Iliad never wearies of showing." So the use of force is fundamentally a dehumanizing thing in violence. Its purpose, the specific change which occurs, is to make the victim of that violence less than they are. This is what it means to suffer harm, the second part of our definition. To suffer is to lose some aspect of being. Anything which we can lose, we identify as a part of ourselves. This might be a rank or position, the ability to take a certain action, a prized possession, or even a loved one. These are all things that identify who we are. They're a part of our identity. And that when they are taken away, a part of us is taken with it. So to suffer in any way is to also suffer a loss of being, just as death. It's just the smaller version. So we find that it's unnatural for us as well. So why does it continually occur? Well, in order to understand that, we look to the third part of our definition. That violence is used to resolve conflict. All conflict is a conflict of desires. One person or party has a desire which they need met, and the other has their own. These desires are considered to be in conflict when they are incompatible, when only one can be fulfilled. And as often as not, the resolution for this conflict is the use of force, either through the elimination of the opposition entirely, or through the inflicting of suffering. So conflict then seems to be the fundamental root of violence, suffering. Is there some way to eliminate it? Maybe, maybe not. We will find it comes from two sources. The first is difference. We are in conflict when we want different things, when we have different ideas of what is good to have or to do, different opinions. This is why the human race has fought over different opinions of religion or ownership, gender, or just about anything else you can possibly think of in between. So perhaps if we simply eliminate difference, we can eliminate conflict. In the modern day, we often see a push towards globalization, towards complete equality through the elimination of difference. But we will find there's a more fundamental root for conflict that cannot be eliminated. Conflict does not only occur when we have differences, but when we have similarities, when there's a kind of sameness. This is what French historian and anthropologist René Girard calls symmetry and identity. When two people do not have a different idea of what they desire, but exactly the same idea. They both desire the same good, but find themselves incapable of both possessing that same good in the same way at the same time. An example of this, which Girard gave in an interview in 1997, which you will also see on your quotation handout, he says, "You will wonder why two teenagers will fall in love with the same girl. You will find the answer is because they are friends." This example is very useful to us. It shows that the two teenagers in question are not in conflict because of their differences, but because they are so much the same. They have the same idea of what they desire in a lover, but they cannot both possess her in the same way at the same time. Think what you will about that. But this is the symmetry between them. But it is because no matter how much the same they are still different people. They are not exactly the same. This is their particular identity. So what we find is that whether or not people are very different or very much the same, we can be drawn into conflict nonetheless. And where there is conflict, there is room for it to be resolved through violence. This is why violence has never truly gone out of fashion, despite civilization's best efforts. Even today, when we open the news, we are faced with domestic abuse, mass shootings, acts of terror, and foreign wars. So, we seem to be in quite a dilemma. At this point, we will turn to our response to this dilemma, the reason you all came here. First, this will be done by looking at the Iliad, a story of bloody war. This takes place within the Trojan War, one which bears a convenient resemblance to Girard's two teenagers. Paris, Troy, and Menelaus of Sparta both want the same girl, but find themselves incapable of sharing her. Thus, they are in conflict over her. But there is a more central conflict in the Iliad than this. It is the conflict within the human person as a being which must die. As something which is fated to die, but has an innate desire to continue living. The desire to transform oneself from mortal to immortal. So the aspect of heroism that we see here is warrior heroism. This is the act of inflicting suffering on others to take something from them, their possessions, their land, their very being, and in doing so, gain renown and glory, something which exists in the minds of others that can live on after one's own death. This conflict between mortality and divinity is set forward clearly at the very beginning of the epic, in the famous proeme. Quote, "Sing, goddess, the rage of Peleus' son Achilles, and its devastation which put pains thousandfold upon the Achaeans, hurled in their multitudes to the house of Hades." This proeme invokes two things: the divinity of the goddess, the muse, which is incapable of suffering death, and the mortality of man, which by nature must suffer death, hurled in their multitudes to the house of Hades. This conflict is embodied in Achilles more so than any other hero. As a demigod born of an immortal mother, he is inextricably connected to the divine world. A part of his identity already exists there, and he seeks to step into it entirely. But he is also born of a mortal father, and thus has inherited his mortal nature and is doomed to die a mortal death. Very early on in the epic, he remarks, "I carry two sets of destiny towards the day of my death. Either if I stay here and fight beside the city of the Trojans, my return home is gone, but my glory shall be everlasting. But if I return home to the beloved land of my fathers, the excellence of my glory is gone, but there will be long life left for me, and my end in death will not come to me quickly." Achilles is faced with the unfair decision of living either a short life with a brief chance at immortality, or a long life with no chance at all. He chooses the former, and chooses to carry it out through this warrior heroism, to gain renown that will make him immortal. and at first he succeeds. Throughout the epic, Achilles remains undefeated in combat. Yet despite his preeminence, he suffers humiliation nonetheless. The girl Briseis is taken from him, and he is publicly disgraced by Agamemnon. The respect and renown, which was the very thing that he sought to use as a method to immortality, has just become another way that he can suffer, something else that can be taken away from him. He begins to see the cracks in the system, the ways that it doesn't work. Nevertheless, he persists. He continues to attempt to set himself apart from others, to be above them. In doing so, this will make him immortal, or so he hopes. He continues on. He then removes himself and his forces from the field of battle in an attempt to force Agamemnon to recognize his glory, to recognize that they cannot hope to win this war without him. But by the time Agamemnon realizes this, it's already far too late. Achilles has long since abandoned human renown, as he has only seen that it is just another path to mortality, another way to suffer. By the ninth book, he says, "Fate is the same for the man who holds back, the same if he fights hard. We are all held in a single honor, the brave with the weaklings. A man dies still if he has done nothing, as one who has done much. Nothing is won for me now that my heart has gone through its afflictions." Achilles has entirely abandoned mortal renown. He sees that it is completely worthless. Only the honor that comes from Zeus, as he says, will suffice for his purposes now. His quest for immortality has not come to an end, nor have his sufferings. The next stage of his journey into understanding his own mortality and attempting to confront it and overcome it comes through the loss of his beloved friend Patroclus. Now, the loss of a loved one is one of the hardest losses that a human being can suffer. This is because so much of our identity is bound up with the other. This is precisely what it means to relate, is to see oneself in the other, to be able to imagine oneself as the other. We say, put yourself in someone else's shoes, right? That is precisely what it means to relate. So when someone who occupies so much of our identity, so much of who and what we are, is lost, it takes a significant portion of our being with them. Achilles feels this acutely when he loses Patroclus, as he has already set himself apart from everyone else. Patroclus is his last link to human community. This propels him forward into his final confrontation, no longer longing for immortality, only revenge. He is still operating through the use of force. He has lost his mortal armor, taken by Hector from the fallen form of Patroclus, and marches forward clad in the armor of the gods. Through force alone, he acts not as a mortal, but as a god. He routs not only the mortal Trojan army, but fights against and alongside the gods themselves. But it's still only a cruel irony. No matter his force, he must still suffer a mortal death. And in his attempt to overcome it, he only confirms it. Achilles has taken his human armor, or Hector has taken Achilles' human armor. And so now his outward appearance, his image, is that of Achilles' mortal self. So Achilles strikes him down in an attempt to overcome his own mortality. After slaying his truly mortal enemy, he mutilates the body. Quote, "In both of his feet he made holes by the tendons, in the space between the ankle and the heel, and drew thongs of oxhide through them, and fastened them to the chariot, so as to let the head drag." After killing his enemy, he pierces him through what we today call the Achilles tendon. This is because it will prove to be the place where Achilles receives his own mortal wound. It is a sign of his own demise. His quest for immortality through sheer force has failed. No amount of victory over others can stop him from being the victim of suffering and death. And there is only a short time left for him on this earth. The only peace that he can find is in returning to the community which he tried so hard to distance himself from. Through the sharing of suffering between himself and Priam. To have a community formed around the fact that they are suffering mortal beings. Now, community becomes a far stranger answer to mortality than warrior heroism ever was. To acknowledge and embrace one's own suffering and mortality and sharing it with others creates an identity. A community is fundamentally a shared identity. Therefore, it creates a part of one's identity which does survive death. This is an idea which Homer put forward in the Iliad, and we see it expanded and repeated throughout other works of literature. The idea of Rome in the Aeneid becomes a larger community, a larger identity, which the hero can put glory towards, to create something which has more meaning than his fleeting mortal life. We also see it in the death of Socrates. He dies for his city, for the youth, for philosophy, for something greater than himself. This gives us the idea of sacrificial heroism. The idea that heroism lies not in inflicting suffering on others, but allowing it to be inflicted on oneself. To be not the victor of violence, but the victim. And we see this idea most clearly in the story of Christ. Christian violence might seem to be also a contradictory term. We don't normally think of Christianity as a fundamentally violent institution. We think of it as turning the other cheek, right? We see theologians, saints, and we see saints constantly giving in a peaceful way. But it is built around an extraordinary act of violence. It is the act of sacrifice. Not the sacrifice of the Old Testament, as it was instituted in the law of Moses. This was, as René Girard calls it, a deliberate act of collective substitution, performed at the expense of the victim, absorbing all of the internal tensions, feuds, and rivalries pent up within the community. Now, to explain that, I know there's a lot of information in there. The act of sacrifice is choosing a victim upon which to inflict suffering, at least the act of animal sacrifice, as it was in the Old Testament. This is done in order to avoid divine punishment from God or retribution from man. It is an act of violence in an attempt to preserve community, not only between men, but also with God. However, this act of sacrifice proves insufficient for two reasons. The first is that the victims of this sacrifice were only animals. They were animals which had found a place within human community. According to Girard, the sacrificial animals were always the most prized for their usefulness, the gentlest, most innocent creatures, whose habits and instincts brought them most closely into harmony with man. They could have an imitation of human community without being members of the community themselves. This meant that as victims of sacrifice, they were only substitute victims or surrogate victims. So it was built on a kind of falsehood. According to Girard, sacrificial substitution implies a degree of misunderstanding. Its vitality as an institution depends on its ability to conceal the displacement upon which the rite is based. The second reason why it proves insufficient is very simply that while it is an act of violence to avoid further violence, to avoid suffering, it cannot prevent death. No matter how many bulls or sheep or doves were slaughtered in the temple, man would still suffer death. This is the idea that Christ revolutionizes. He takes the act of sacrifice and substitutes the substitute victim with himself. Christian suffering requires a different act of substitution, to make oneself the victim of suffering. This is done as a gift to the greater community, to that thing which creates a larger identity for ourselves, which survives death. It also, in being a willing sacrifice, as it is in the case of Christ, who enters Jerusalem, where he is whipped, stripped, beaten, forced to carry his cross, and finally nailed to it by the same people who had cheered for him only days before. In doing all of this willingly, he is the one willing the violence to be done, in which case he is now the force behind the violence. So it no longer matches our initial definition of suffering. It is not an outside force taking away some aspect of his being or his entire being in death. He is the force behind it because he is the one willing it. So in this way, it circumvents the problem of suffering by transforming suffering and the problem of death through community. This is the center of Christian sacrifice. In the words of Christ himself, greater love has no one than this, that he laid down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. This last part is in reference to the following of his teachings, which makes men a part of one community. This greater identity into which we put our suffering, even the suffering of death, our entire lives, allows us to become more than mere mortals. It is with all this in mind that we can understand our very last quotation. Quote, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Amen, amen, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit." This is the way that violence and death have been transformed into something greater than the mere existence of mortality. This is Christian sacrifice. So, you're going to die. What exactly are you going to do about it? Thank you.
Thank you, Blaise. We'll begin with questions from our panelists.
That's good. Blaise, let me go back to something that you said about midway through. You're thinking about Achilles and his kind of rejection of mortal renown or human renown. And I take it that there you mean that he rejects the gifts of Agamemnon, all the stuff.
Right. Sorry, I didn't know you were talking.
All the stuff that Agamemnon offers him, which no longer means anything to him. What does strike me as meaning something to him, though, is the other kind of renown, which is, to be remembered in song, to have his fame carried on. And I got a little confused when you were talking about the ending with Priam, whether or not Achilles has given up his desire for that kind of renown in kind of be sort of reestablishing a human community. In other words, is his sort of final state to be indifferent to fame, or because he's kind of rediscovered a human bond, or is it still very much part of what his whole desire was?
Difficult to say. I think a certain amount of that might be left up to interpretation, but I'm much more inclined to say his quest for mortal renown and fame is completely abandoned. Now, it should be noted that stuff is very important in the Iliad, right? When people are defeated, the victor takes things from them. Not only does he take their life, but he takes pieces of their armor, their war gear. It's a very tangible way of showing that he has taken the being of another human, right? to add to his own. It's a very carnivorous system, right? So stuff is very important, and Agamemnon offers a lot of rewards in his attempt to lure Achilles back into the fold, as it were, to get him back on their side in an attempt to win the conflict. But I think the fact that Achilles rejects all of it, I think, is a key to understanding that he has rejected all these passing mortal things which can only be taken away from him. Even if he does regain his fame and return to the field of battle, even if he does regain that renown, it's been proved to him that it can be taken away. And so he's lost trust in it.
Just a kind of follow-up, is there any way to see Achilles himself in the terms that you're laying out here for sacrifice? Is Achilles himself in any way interpretable as a sacrifice?
I'd say it's possible. As a hero at all, right? As a character who goes through this journey and endures all this suffering to learn something which we can then learn from, right? I think that can be interpreted as sacrifice, right? Any suffering that has created a greater meaning, I think could fit that definition.
Yes, actually, I was curious about pretty much the same thing. By the end of the Iliad, you're saying that Achilles is realizing that what he's looking for is really some sort of community that embraces or acknowledges suffering. Would he have been better off if he just realized that and left and didn't fight this way next?
Right. Well, this is something of a paradox with the Iliad, right? Where it's all about how these mortal things, mortal renown, don't mean anything. But if that's true, why are we talking about Achilles today? Why do we remember him for fighting the river god Scamandros? Why do we remember him for killing Hector? I think there is a way in which aspects of mortal renown do actually become immortal, so long as there are human beings who remember it. But I think for Achilles, that has lost all. Right? What he talks about is how fate is the same for the brave man or the weakling. Right? He's going to die anyway, and so he's not going to appreciate it. Now, it might be strange to answer that with community, in the sense that he's still going to die and no longer be a part of that community. But I think he still sees it as a way to greater meaning, which won't be taken away. We can't be victimized in such a way that whatever meaning was generated by that community has been removed, because it was built around the fact that they could have things taken away.
Can you tell me more about that community? Can you explain a little more what's good about it? Why is this somehow not just as real as the other perceived goods or ways of becoming immortal or fighting against immortality?
Right. I think it can involve a process of abstraction, meaning that, like, right, one of the examples I used was Rome, right? A way of creating larger identity, you put glory towards it, and it makes part of your identity a part of something bigger, right? Something which will survive your own death. Well, the Roman Empire fell anyways. But Rome still exists today, right? And the Roman Empire, as an abstract, exists within all of our minds. This is still a concept we think of all the time. Yeah, immortality can be said in more ways than one.
So this kind of community, it has to be some kind of empire that reigns throughout history?
Some kind of presence, an identity.
Had a good community, and then we were wiped out.
That's a very good question. That's a very good question. Yeah, if you were part of a small community that was entirely wiped out with no memory of it at all, what would you do? I'm not entirely sure. I'm not quite sure exactly how I would address that.
Maybe torn by Homer.
Maiden Aida, Peleado,
Blaise, is violence the only path for Christian heroism?
I think so.
It sounds a little bit like you're saying that the Christian, right, can only be hero, we appropriate profoundly problematic tools of
Yeah. I think unless you appropriate suffering, it's just suffering. And if you don't make your life worth anything, you just die. And that is really all there is to say about it. Human beings do come to an end. And if the life isn't given greater meaning, right? And we do that by appropriating the suffering. I have to paraphrase because I don't remember the exact quotation from Viktor Frankl. He says, man can endure just about any what, so long as he is given a why. Right? And that is the appropriation of suffering. I think this is where it gets a little odd, is that we create or we find some meaning to put our suffering into, to put our suffering towards. What's in question is whether or not we simply arbitrarily create that meaning or not. That was not the subject of this presentation, but I do think is a fascinating subject that I will look into in the future. Is whether or not meaning has any meaning at all.
Frankel's point is, it doesn't have to force, the meaning that one creates doesn't actually have to correspond to reality.
Right.
Like,
He sees it in the spiritual realm and the psychological realm. He's more leaning towards that it may not have to be real at all. It may be at least just real for your experience. I'm not totally sure if I agree with that, but I'll find out.
So just to be clear, we have to do the appropriation of suffering because suffering is inevitable.
Because it's going to happen to you anyway. You need to create some meaning behind it in order for it to be anything at all except just plain old loss.
Questions from the audience?
All right. Ms. Ramsey?
So you talked about Socrates briefly in relation to sacrificial heroism. So with Socrates choosing to not escape because of his values, it doesn't seem like he's the force behind the violence that was enacted on him. So, and likewise with Jesus, because he chose to suffer the violence with a free gift of self, it doesn't seem like he's the force behind it. So is the refusal to abandon your values when faced with conflict really the force behind violence?
That can be said of in several ways, right? On one hand, yeah, it's not like there's no one nailing Christ's hands to the cross. It's not like that guy doesn't exist and is not choosing to do that. He is still one cause of that act. But I think in willing to do so, you are now, like I said, the active participant, right? So when one dies for one's views, when one becomes a martyr, one is now willing that violence to happen and is at least becoming an equal sharer in the doing of that violence. That's why I call the act of sacrifice an extraordinary act of violence, because we're pretty familiar with the concept of sacrifice, but we don't think of it in terms of the victim being the one doing the violence. But I think that is an actual change that occurs within the act of sacrifice. Does that answer your question, or is it still kind of? Because I'd say, yeah, some causality still remains within simply the material world, right, or the normal things that are in plain old violence. But a lot of it has been shifted, right? You are no longer, it is no longer happening against your will when you suffer, when you're willing sacrifice, right? It's no longer the use of force dominating over your own will.
When you talk about force, you're more talking about what Dr. Schubert was mentioning, which is this active participation and the appropriation of the meaning.
Appropriation of an existing.
Thank you.
Mr. Gettix?
Mr. Galbraith, could you speak to, transcendence and violence together? I guess when I think about Achilles killing Hector wearing his armor, and in a sense, he's transcending his human nature through violence. He's doing the thing that God does, which is take things out of being, but he's taking himself out of that kind of being in a sense.
So
Yeah.
that's something I talked about in my thesis somewhat, didn't really address here, is that while there's a victim of violence, there's also a victor. while someone loses something, someone gains something, which means someone is gaining being, which sounds like a weird thing to say. But effectively, it makes the victor of that violence greater than they were. If it was making the victim less than they were, it was making the victor greater than they were. I think there is something fundamental about force itself, right? The power to do anything seems to be an elevation of being, right? That's something you have, is the power to do something. So there's a way in which you could say the use of force itself is in some way divinizing, or transcendent was the word you used. That's a very strange notion, because we live in a very sanitized age, and despite, like I remarked, the presence of violence all around us, we pretty much always see it as this barbaric thing of the past, something human progress will inevitably overcome. One day, one of the things we read in the curriculum here, actually, and you read, Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. He says every motion throughout Western history, at least in the political realm, has been one towards equilibrium, right? To eliminate difference, to eliminate conflict. We like to think that that's true, that one day we're just going to eliminate it entirely. But we do see it today, but we don't like to think about it. We don't think about it in terms of one thing is actually being a conqueror, actually being greater than something else. We'll pretty much always condemn it. We never see the positive side of it. Yeah, like I said, that's something I talk a little bit more about in my thesis.
Can I follow up?
Yeah.
So is Homer, you think, agreeing with what you just said, that there's something that makes you great about killing other people?
I think it's possible.
Or is that something that's refuted by the end of the story? And because it seems like that plays into the importance of this community and whether the violence really was necessary to have Achilles be the hero in this, or to be just the person he ends up being.
Well, even the renown he was seeking, right, in his glorification, still reliant on community, right? There should be someone to remember him. Sorry, your original question was not that.
I just wanted to know, so you were just talking about how violence is a way of transcending, becoming godlike. Is that something?
Is that something Homer is
view on
attempting to
that?
disprove? No, I don't know. I think he just points out that it can go either way. You never just unqualifiedly become divine by overpowering other people, because one day you'll be overpowered yourself, and you'll be made something low. I don't think he may not entirely deny the divinity of force, but he at least goes to show that it's not something reliable to escape. So that's almost a yes or no answer, a yes and no answer. Wherein, yeah, there may still be something there for Homer, but his point, I think, in treating it the way he does, is to show that it's not something that can be relied on to solve this paradox of human death.
What do you think it is in Achilles that allows him to be the most reliable on this unity force within the Iliad? He is the one who farms the river. He is the greatest that he can, but he wields force mostly divine amongst all the other heroes. What is about him? Even as he becomes victim to it.
There's two things to say about that. First is that he is a demigod. And he's not the only demigod in the Iliad. There are others. No, he doesn't. In some ways, yeah. But they are, right, the demigods are somewhat set apart from the regular mortals. But there is another aspect to that wherein Achilles' understanding of the cosmos in general is expanding throughout his journey, right? Before entering the final confrontation, when he gets the armor from Hephaestus, he does not only get the armor, but he gets the shield, upon which is inscribed the entirety of the human world, this mortal world that he looks at in a single picture. This is what we call a God's eye view, right? The entire human world all at once, and no one else is capable of looking at it. It says the Myrmidons have to flee and look away from it. They're terrified. But when Achilles looks on it, it says his eyes glitter like sun flare. No, I think the constant revelation of the cosmos to him is something that happens as he progresses into his understanding of his place in that cosmos as a mortal thing. As he comes to understand the paradox of his own being. I think he comes to understand more about what it means to be divine because he's learning more about what it means to be mortal.
Does it at all answer Dr. Spoon's question about why he has to go through all
Why he
of
has
the
to do all of
violence, like to get to point 4?
Right. I think so, somewhat. It's not the only thing. Obviously, there is just the general steps of him coming to understand how worthless different things are, or what can hurt him, what can become a source of suffering. Ultimately, embracing those things, right? It's all an interior journey for you. Dr. Virginia?
Thank you, Blaise. I want to ask about the book 9 analysis that you gave us in that reflection on we're all held in a single honor. That may be an insight, but it isn't the end of the Achillean force. He gives injunctions to Patroclus when Patroclus wants to go out to save the glory for him. Okay? When Hector comes up to vision, he is still, he's had the philosophical insight, but he persists in his nature, especially even more after the death of Patroclus, which enters into the mix the bonds of friendship and love, which fuel and give a kind of humanity to him well before we see Priam.
Right.
We also see the humanity of him in Briseis's love for him. She cries when she has to leave him.
Yeah.
So there are many indications that his personhood is multidimensional and profoundly aware, perhaps in a way because he was supposed to be Zeus. He would have been Zeus. He's not like the other demigods. So more is at stake.
He sort of had the rug pulled out from under him in a cosmic way.
Right.
Right. No, that's part of the prophecy is that Zeus actually had his eye on Thetis, right?
Yeah.
But there was a prophecy that Thetis' son would overcome his father. So he had to force her to marry a mortal so he would overcome his mortal father rather than himself. No, Zeus didn't want to be victimized that way.
Well, and even when he sees Priam, he says, "Watch out, Priam! Don't push my friendliness with you right here. I could just as soon smash you." Right. So I don't think he's giving up this nature of his, which makes him so consequential.
Right. I mean, when he disregards human honor, he doesn't stop being violent.
No.
The story still continues to be about bloody violence.
Yeah.
But he's no longer seeking things from men, right? The exact phrase is the honor from Zeus, right? He seeks renown in the eyes of the immortals. Because that's not going to go away. I don't know. We do see him as a part of community beforehand, but there are these really key links that hold him there, and Patroclus is one of them. That's someone he actually does care for. He despises Agamemnon. And I don't think he has respect for Phoenix or Nestor, but you don't see him being really close friends with Odysseus or Menelaus or Ajax, any of them really. Achilles doesn't seem to have friends except for Patroclus. That's why the loss of Patroclus is so heavy. I think that was the real community that he had. He may have had a place within the Achaean army. But not a real bond, not a real linked identity.
Well, anyway, Pierre Menal makes the point that if you think of Socrates as a pre-Christian figure, he in fact is a poor match as an old man who accepts his death, as opposed to the young man Achilles.
Right. Now, Manet says a lot of very interesting things about the Iliad, some of which didn't make a lot of sense to me. Metamorphosis in the City is very revelatory. But he says some very odd things. One of the things he says is that he compares Hector. He says that Hector is a sacrifice and compares Hector to Jesus, which weirded me out a lot. I wasn't quite sure what. Yeah. The name's worth reading, but very odd.
I'll follow up on that one. I'm sorry, other people want to ask questions. I just wanted to kind of go from the idea of Hector as sacrifice. I mean, there are two people that wear Achilles' armor, right? Which he got from Peleus when Peleus was married to Peleus.
Achillean spear as well.
Right. So Peleus gives the armor to Achilles, who gives it to Patroclus, who in dying has the armor stripped from him.
Apollo strikes it off.
Right, and he's revealed as Patroclus rather than as Achilles. Hector puts it on. So, there's something about putting on the identity of Achilles. It's part of what Achilles is working at also. Right? To let your friend wear your armor, and your mortal enemy wears it. You kill that mortal enemy, and stripping off the armor, which, as you say, is a kind of glory, you reveal this person who tried to be you, and then you demean him. You try to run him down. So what does that make of the last instance of giving back the body of Hector to Priam? What is that saying about the significance of sort of no longer seeing everybody as versions of yourself or something like that?
Oh, interesting. I think the first thing to say towards answering that is that there's a way in which the victim of even the warrior's violence is a sacrifice. They have to lose so the victor can gain. They have to die so that the victor can gain. The armor is also an identity, right? Because it's been passed down from Peleus, it is now something that has outlived Peleus and is going to outlive Achilles and Hector as well. That's something that can have identity ascribed to it. I think in the past, the passing of it around shows that this kind of identity is something that can outlast a single person. That can also be something that increases the glory of the person for taking it, right? It's a relic, something very valuable, and thus in taking it, I think there's great renown and glory to be earned for the one who does that, right? So for Achilles, right, gave it to someone else to wear to win glory, not too much, as Dr. Virginia pointed out. It's then taken from Patroclus, and he takes it back, and it's made all the more glorious that he is reclaiming what is rightfully his. But at the same time, he's also trying to deny his mortality and confirming it. I don't know. It's one of the many layers to that event, and it's why it's such a striking event. It's a striking imagery that sticks in our imagination. Mr. Cole?
Thank you very much. I'm still a little unclear of what the distinction between mortal renown and a communal attempt or an engagement with the community.
That was Dr. Zepeda's question.
Okay.
Yeah, more or less that you create something that exists outside of yourself that can outlive you. And as Dr. Zepeda was pointing out, it's still possible for that thing to die. I think that just means that there's a possibility for it to fail still.
Well, I agree that there's still a possibility for it to fail. I'm just not sure how. You seem to be saying that Achilles turns from one of those things to the other, and I'm not clear how those are actually different ways of creating something outside yourself.
Because they both still rely on other people. Right.
Well, right. So one of them relies on other people because they need to think well of you because you're famous. The other one relies on other people because you're friends with them, but they're still thinking well of you. So how is the community thing not just moral renown, but better because it's more closer to your character?
More because Achilles has lost faith in the other one. He's come to understand that his renown, no matter how much he gains, can just be easily taken away by someone else, right? Agamemnon has just publicly disgraced. I think he doesn't see that same weakness in a community of suffering with Priam, with the others, right? So much of their community is built around remembrance of the dead, right? And preserving their identity after death. The funerary rites of Patroclus last for quite a while. And in that moment, Achilles is presiding over the games. He and Agamemnon almost seem to have switched roles, and Achilles seems far more kingly when presiding over the funerary rites. I think it's because that community, right, is not something that they're all trying to compete over. Glory is, this may be something I should have addressed, I guess, before, but glory is a competitive resource, right? If someone's got to die so in order that I can take it, then it's sort of a finite way that it works.
So it's a glory is something that I create for myself in the minds of other people. Whereas the communal identity is something that I create with another group and share with them. So if they lose, if I am cut out from that, then those people have also cut out part of their community themselves.
But still exists despite what's lost.
Right, of course. Whereas the honor thing, they can totally take all my honor away. They haven't lost anything. They've been back to gain stuff. Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Galbraith, for very good oration. I was wondering if you could interpret something for me. That thing is, when we see Achilles in the Odyssey, he is dead in the underworld, and he says that he would rather, essentially, he would rather be a living servant than the king of the dead. I'm wondering if you could just interpret that for me in light of your oration.
Yeah, I mean, that's because everything I've talked about is an attempt to preserve life, to stop it from going into non-existence. The Iliad is about accepting that moral existence. So like finding a way to circumvent the problem of death, but not by fighting it, not by running from it, but actually by embracing it, which is very strange. The Odyssey is different. It's not just about accepting humanity, it's about accepting a very particular humanity, right? It's a story about Odysseus accepting his roles and relations, right, as king and father. And the appearance of Achilles as a ghost in the underworld, right? I think that only goes to show that every attempt is one to preserve some aspect of life, right? And he couldn't preserve all of it, couldn't actually just live forever as God. That attempt failed. And I think that's why when he appears in the underworld, he's still longing for the completeness of life. And I think that's why this idea, which is set forward by Homer in the Iliad, is then developed in the Odyssey somewhat, and then is developed even further and reaches its culmination in the story of Christ.